we were considering some what I call objections to some information that I've been trying to share with you. And we come now, I think I brought the subject up, concerning what the Scriptures teach about elders, bishops, pastors, shepherds. Terms, according to my understanding, that are all used to describe the persons who had the responsibility to shepherd or care for and feed the flock of Christ. And someone may say, well, if you have to have elders or shepherds, that indicates organization, and the next step from that would be organized churches. I would beg to differ on that, and I think I can show you from the Scriptures that that's not the case. Although some of those who were trying to return to the New Testament order do what they call restoring the church years back, and I've mentioned Barton W. Stone. He held the view that when he read about Paul telling Titus that he left him in Crete to set in order the things that were wanting and appoint elders in every city, that involved the setting up, the organizing, constituting, they call it, churches. I may have mentioned that at the close of the last lesson. If I did, I'm sorry. The reason it came to my mind again is that to say that they had that concept, some of them did back in the mid-1800s. I think, again, that this problem arises from, first of all, the background that these men were coming from, where they were accustomed to talking about ordained elders and preachers, and coming out of a system where they actually had ordination papers, and they had to be ordained under the authority of the conference in an official manner. And so they carried this over, and I think I've talked about it in the past too, that it came down to the different denominations from the apostate system of Roman Catholicism, where they had the priest, the bishops, cardinals, up to the Pope, so forth. And that they had to have somebody there before they could have the Mass. There had to be some official ordained person there that was authorized to administer that to the assembly. All right, enough of that. I think it also, this difficulty that we're facing here in this objection, is due to a lack of understanding what the responsibilities and duties of these shepherds was. Now, I am purposely using the word shepherds, and I think it comes from the idea, it may be the same word that is translated pastors. I didn't do enough research on that particular thing before I started the discussion, but I want to use the term shepherds in referring to these men that are sometimes called elders and bishops, because I think it helps us to have a less traditional view of the words as I use them. So I'm going to be referring to them quite often as shepherds. Now, I said I'm afraid we suffer from a lack of understanding about the duties and responsibilities of these shepherds, and are sometimes commonly called elders, and in the scriptures too. I want to share with you some information concerning the extreme, what I would term the extreme view on the matter of elders or shepherds. I won't go into the minute details of it, but there some around 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, a situation developed where that I, as a quote member of a quote local congregation of the Church of Christ, began to write and publish newspaper articles. And I may have mentioned this before, but I'm going to bring it back in here because it has to do with this idea of the responsibility of the elders. And it also has something to do with organized churches. Because I was a member of an organized church recognized by the state, the civil government, as a non-profit organization, there was a financial liability concerning, or at least there was a fear of it, that if I wrote something and put it in the newspaper that could be termed, that I could be liable for, something like slander, that then that could all fall back on this non-profit organization called a local congregation of the Church of Christ. So one of the elders told me that it would be required of me to turn in my newspaper articles and let the elders critique it, censor it if necessary, before it was published, and argued that they had the right by the scriptures, the authority to do that. Well, I disagreed. I said I can't find it in the scripture. I don't believe that's correct. So then we got in, there was a lot of discussion about it. Some older, well-respected brethren in the Church of Christ were called in, and there was a big discussion about it. And I'll share with you what developed out of that and the claims that were made. First of all, it was claimed that elders or shepherds have authority over members in all matters of human judgment. I know I've mentioned that before too. But I want to bring it up because it has to do with this thing of the organized churches. First of all, that statement itself is unfounded in the Scriptures. No way. I mean, if it's just not there. If I being a member of that local congregation, as we called it back then, if I was going to try to make a decision whether I left my job and moved to another city, or even was just going to change jobs in the same area there, that's a matter of human judgment. And to say that these shepherds have the authority in all matters of human judgment is absolute, total control. And it's contrary to every principle you find through the New Testament. So, as I said one time before, I never did believe that, but that was presented. Now, the next thing was, let's see if I can get my notes straight here now. Yes. In Acts chapter 8, and I'm going to mention this again after a while, hopefully, those who were called out of the world by the gospel and added to that assembly that God is collecting, thousands of them were scattered because of persecution under the leadership of Saul of Tarsus. But the text says that they went everywhere preaching the word. Now, who then had the oversight of those that were scattered? I think I brought up at the end of the last session that we have a tendency to when we say they were preaching, that we see them up in the pulpit in front of an assembly. But I'm of the understanding that all they were doing was simply sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with whoever they came into contact. And there was no way that the elders of the called out of God in Jerusalem could oversee thousands of people as they were scattered. They couldn't even oversee them. They couldn't censor what they were going to say, or if they wanted to scribble out something on a piece of sheepskin and tack it on the wall somewhere that told about something about Jesus. I mean, they had to censor that. So it's just really off the wall. Now, the next point that was claimed about the duties and responsibilities of elders was that elders had the right to hire preachers to preach to the local congregation. We called it back then. And they were hired, and it was argued that they were employees just the same as a secretary or bookkeeper or groundskeeper or janitor or whatever. They became employees hired by the elders, the shepherds. Now, this is a deep subject, and I right now don't want to get into it too far. But where did you find it? Who came up with this idea? Did it occur to them in the Scriptures? I say not. I say that it goes back again to all the way back to the Roman Catholic system, that was handed down, and the different Protestant groups never did let go of it, of having, at first in the Catholic system, the priests, then men who were ordained pastors and carried their ordination papers and answered to the conference, and on down into the so-called Restoration movement. They had to have a minister or a preacher. And finally developed into the idea that elders could hire a preacher to do, my dear listener, what these shepherds were told to do, and that is to feed the flock. That's why in the qualifications that Paul gave, he mentions that they must be able, qualified to teach, and not just elementary things, but they had to be knowledgeable enough in the way of Christ to stop the mouths of what the King James calls the gainsayers, people who were speaking against the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So they were required to be responsible teachers, even to be chosen for that service. So, but what happened, we developed a tradition where the men that were called elders would go out and hire a fellow to come in and have him do the teaching. And it's just as contrary to the Scriptures as a thousand other things that I could bring to your attention out in the various Protestant denominations of the world. Now, a next point, I've got asterisks by them here. It was argued that elders, well, let me back up. I was reasoning, and I still think it's correct, that evangelists in the days of the apostles went out, they proclaimed the gospel. When a number of people believed and obeyed it, the evangelist would either appoint some men at that time to serve as shepherds, or they would go on traveling and they'd make a loop back, and when he'd come later, then they would appoint somebody. But the evangelist did it according to the Scriptures. And that's why I think Paul, well, obviously Paul gave the instructions and the qualifications to Timothy and Titus that he did. But I was told those many years ago that I asked a question, actually. If you had what we called an eldership back then, a plurality of elders or shepherds in a local congregation, we call it, then what if one of them died, or some of them died, or one or two out of the group or whatever, and they needed to have some more elders? Or maybe suppose that the assembly of disciples, the local church, got bigger, and they felt they needed some more elders. Then how would they go about, I don't know what we called it, install them or ordaining them? How would they get more elders or more shepherds? And the answer given to me was, in this discussion, that the eldership would appoint men to that office of an elder, and what I'm calling a shepherd now. So what you have, a situation where that you've got a system that's kind of like a board of directors that is self-perpetuating. And so far we've got these, I'll call them shepherds, have authority in all matters of human judgment over all members of the local congregation. Secondly, even though they're supposed to be teachers themselves, they can hire a preacher to do that. And if he doesn't preach like they want him to, or doesn't visit the sick as much as he wants to, whatever they decide, they can fire him. Then, thirdly, the elders could appoint new elders to serve with them in what we called the eldership. Then the last thing here that I have noted down, one of the men that was making this, taking this view and presenting it, said that he was both a preacher hired by the eldership of a local congregation, and he was also an elder. So here is a man that's hired by the eldership, but he is himself on the board. So he's working for himself. I just don't know why that we have to have such an organization, and where there's any authority in the scriptures for things like that, in order for these shepherds to do their work. If you'll just review in your thinking what that elders or shepherds were responsible for, they would feed the flock, protect the flock from people who would come in and teach false doctrine. Feeding was the teaching. They were also to guide, admonish, and if it became necessary, they would have to rebuke and exhort those sheep that came into their in contact with them. And I've talked with you in an earlier session about this problem of thinking this local congregation idea. The reason that I think that we had this idea of the local congregation is that we were fearful. It was feared that if we said that shepherds or elders had responsibility over people, a broader area than a certain number of people that were holding meetings together in the same place. If we allowed them to have any, we called it authority, I don't think it's necessarily a good word, but over some wider area, then that was setting the stage for developing into having bishops over a wide area, and then going on up to finally getting the Pope, who's the head of that apostate system. So I think that's one of the fears that they had. But again, I think it has to do with a misunderstanding of the duty and responsibility of these shepherds. Shepherds were never intended to lord it over the call out of God anywhere. And I'm going to make the statement right here, and if somebody can show me I'm wrong, I'll back off of it. It seems to me that the only authority that shepherds can exercise is by teaching, either by word or by example. Now, I don't mean to say that they wouldn't have leadership in certain matters. But as sheep follow the shepherd as he leads, shepherds don't and can't drive the sheep. You try to drive them, they'll scatter. I've checked my time there. I've got a little bit left, about 5 minutes. Now, in that Well, let me say this before I go farther. "30-something years ago, if I had heard this kind of talk, and a lot of other things that I've been saying lately in these sessions, I would have just written Grady Parton off. I would have just said, there's no way that can be correct. But the reason was I'd never questioned our tradition. And I'm asking you to question it, to honestly go to the Scriptures and search for yourselves. Or yourself, I should say. Okay, now, if you go by the idea of the local congregation and elders having all this authority, then they can threaten to cast you out of the assembly, like Diotrephes did. But if an individual obeys the teaching or the instructions of their shepherds because you are afraid of them, afraid they'll cast you out, rather than them taking the time and the effort to teach you the truth on a certain matter, then, and you're not convicted in your own mind about it, but you're just afraid they're going to do something to you if you don't abide by their instructions, then it's no good anyway. Our service has got to come from our convictions of what God wants us to do. Now, I grant you that the Scriptures teach that if a shepherd finds a ram sheep, for example, you know, sheep, some of them stronger than others in the physical fold of sheep. If there's one that keeps just butting the little ones around and knocking them here and there and being mean to them, then that shepherd would take care of that situation. And the text says here, let me see if I can find it, Titus 3:10. Titus, Paul to the, I'm going to call him evangelist Titus, Titus 3:11. Well, I'll back up and get, start verse 9. But avoid foolish questions and genealogies and contentions and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and vain. A man that is an heretic or a factious man, after the first and second admonition, reject, knowing that he that is such is subverted and sinned, being condemned of himself. Now, Titus was told, and by the way, that was action he was supposed to take as an evangelist. And I'm going to suggest to you that every child of God is under the same instructions. Now, not having the same responsibilities as the shepherds, but let me show you something in 2 Thessalonians 3:6-14. 2 Thessalonians 3:6-14. Just need to get this in on this sharing session if I possibly can. I think I can. 2 Thessalonians 3:6-14. Now, Paul is writing to those of the called out in Thessalonica. And here's what he told them to do. 6 through 14. Now we command you, brethren, that in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly, and not after the tradition which he received of us. For yourselves know how ye ought to follow or imitate us, Paul says of himself and other teachers that might have been with him. He may have been using that editorial we idea. For we behave not ourselves disorderly among you, neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought or worked with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow us. Now watch this thing about the disorderly conduct. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such we command and exhort by our Lord Jesus Christ, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. That's instruction given to the individual, child of God. Now they could take such action as a group, but the individual was told this right here. And I've said this before in one of these sharing sessions, a man comes to my house, asks for help, and says that he needs some food and so forth. Well, if I give it to him, and then over a period of time find out he won't work, then I can take this text right here and say, look, Paul said, I'm not supposed to support you in that. It's not helping you, it's hurting you, and it's not right. Now you have to find you a job. I'm not feeding you. And you wouldn't have to have a shepherd I wouldn't have to have a shepherd to come and tell me that. Now, a shepherd might find out there was somebody like that in the community, by his own actions, had proven himself to be that type of person, and then that shepherd might come in and call his sheep together and say, listen, I want to warn you about Joe Blow over there. He's come in from out of state or so forth and so on. He's already imposed on several of our number here, and he won't work. So just watch out for him and don't have anything to do with him. That type of situation can arise, but it's an individual responsibility. Okay, let's see. I guess I'll stop right there because I've run over on my time a little bit. See what we're going to take up next here. We're going to talk about fathers teaching their children. And you might want to start reading in Ephesians chapter 6 about that, verse 4 there. What we're dealing with here now is we're going back to this idea of what is it that can't be done by a number or an individual, a number of disciples or one disciple. What is it that can't be done according to the teachings of Christ, whatever He's told us to do, without having an organized church? And I got sidetracked over here dealing with this objection, but I felt like it was good to bring that in at that point. So, let me add this right quick. Sometimes, again, I've said it before, sometimes I start thinking about this and I think, you reckon that this is all just a waste of time, that this is not important, and I ought to be, just forget it? But, my dear listener, when I have observed the harm and the problems and the error that develops due to these unscriptural practices that I'm talking about, primarily organizing churches, then I just, and plus the fact when you give them a human name and denominate those churches, then it's promoting era, promoting division, which is contrary to the teaching of Christ. And I just can't help but raise a voice about it and try to share it with you and ask you to study it on your own, and point out to you that sometimes if we don't know any better, then we can have chance for mercy. But if we read it for ourselves and see that we're wrong on something, or if I can show you and ask you to look at it and you find out you're wrong on it, now and you won't do anything about it, that scares me. It would scare me about myself. So please take these things seriously, and we'll try to continue on a little more as soon as we can. Again, I thank you for listening.